So now it's time to plunge in to the 2019 Silicon Valley Index. And I just want to say that the index is an exercise that we practice ritually and rigorously on an annual basis. And I also want to remind you that even though you're holding the index in your hand in printed form, the index also lives at a live and dynamic website. It's called SiliconValleyIndicators.org. You can go there anytime, any day throughout the year, and you will find even more indicators that are in the printed report. And on the website, you can use them interactively. You can download the charts. You can get to the underlying data. You can have the spreadsheets at your fingertips. You can click on the data sources. So we recommend Silicon Valley Indicators to your use. We make it freely available to the community. Then, as part of this exercise, every year at year end, we take a snapshot of the region. It's like a cross section, and then we publish it in this booklet that you now hold, and it is like going to the doctor's office for your annual physical exam. So we're going to talk about what this year's index seems to be telling us about Silicon Valley. Are you ready to go? Let's plunge in. I'd like to tell you that this year's index was hard for us to figure out. It turned out to be something of a Rorschach test. You know the reference, right? The Rorschach tests are when psychologists and psychiatrists will show you these ink blots, and you're supposed to tell your interviewer what the ink blots are reminding you of. And there's no wrong answers, but somehow this exercise is supposed to reveal something about your psyche. Well, that's what the index was for us this year as we looked at the data. It turns out that if there were things that you wanted to be happy about, there was plenty there. And if there are things that you wanted to be downcast about, well, there was also plenty there. And so the way I want to approach it this morning is to tell you that we can look at it both ways. And the way I like to think about it is I just like to say that Silicon Valley is just a very complex creature. It's sort of like people, right? People are complex. People have many facets. And it seems to be the case of Silicon Valley as well. It is a very complicated creature, but we're going to explore some of its facets. I want to start by taking the happy view, all right? So let's look at Silicon Valley, let's look at the index, and let's talk about all of the things that are in there that can make us cheerful, happy, bright, and peppy. And there's quite a bit. Let's start with the employment figures. That's always a nice place to start because people want to know whether we're growing or whether we're shrinking as an economy. Well, in the last calendar year, Silicon Valley added 35,000 new jobs. That's a robust number. So this continues to be a growing economy. The other parts of the region also added jobs. San Francisco added 24,000 new jobs, and that was a huge uptick for them from the previous year. Oakland and the rest of Alameda County added 15,000 new jobs. Then, when you add the other Bay Area counties, they added another 10,000, actually 9,000 plus new jobs. That's interesting to me, actually. Marin, Sonoma, Solano, Napa, Contra Costa, 5 counties generated 9,000 jobs. That tells you right there that the real engine of the region continues to be Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the place that is generating these jobs, and then with San Francisco, it's clear that we have a very powerful twin-engine aircraft. And most of that growth is in tech. We'll talk about that. The grand total, if you'd like to know, was 79,950 new jobs added to our region in the last calendar year. That growth rate is a 2.1% growth rate. Last year, we reported a 3% growth rate. 3.5% the year before. So some people will look at these figures. Again, remember, it's a Rorschach test. They'll look at the figures and they'll say, the engine is slowing down. That could be a reasonable interpretation. The way I like to look at it is to say, well, we've been a red-hot economy. Then we became a white-hot economy. Now we're a hot economy. That's the way I see it. This is a hot economy, growing, but growing at a slightly slower pace than we were the year previously. Now, here's how we can look at it over time, and it is important to get the long-term perspective on this. So here you see Silicon Valley became job negative when our nation fell prey to that epic recession, and that was back in 2008. What's interesting is that Silicon Valley was the last region to succumb to that recession, and then we were the first to emerge from it. We were already growth positive by the year 2009, 2010, and then you'll see here that we have mounted 7, going on 8 years of steady economic growth. And it's, of course, fluctuated. There's been some highs, some lower, but for the most part, it's progressing in that upward northeasterly direction. In other words, this is an economy that's growing and continues to grow. The unemployment rate also continues to fall. The unemployment rate in Silicon Valley today, as of this moment, is 2.2%. Economists will tell you that that's the equivalent of full employment. So really, we are talking about an economy that is at full employment. And it raises some questions about how an economy can grow when it's already at full capacity. And also, truthfully, when some of us look at the region, the stress and the strain upon our infrastructure, you're wondering if we can or even should continue to grow at those red-hot, white-hot rates. So that's another question that we'll be contemplating today as we think about Silicon Valley. Now, I want to talk to you about venture capital, because for us, this was one of the most eye-popping findings in the 2019 index. So here's our venture capital picture. This was a year ago. We put up this chart, and we said to you the region generated $25 billion in venture capital. And we were amazed by that, because that was just that was a very robust number, and one we hadn't really seen. In fact, we have never seen a number like that, with one exception, and that was the year 2000, when, remember, it was the dot-com, and the place was just completely going crazy and overheating. Okay, well, that was last year. That's what we told you last year. Guess what? This year, we blew it out of the water. This is an amazing figure. $50 billion. $50 billion in venture capital was generated in our region and spent on Silicon Valley companies. And there's a split between San Francisco and Silicon Valley. San Francisco accounts for $30 billion, Silicon Valley for $20 billion. That split has fluctuated year to year. We can't detect a pattern. It just seems to be different every year. But taken as a region, $50 billion. I want to put that in some context for you. Here again is the long-term perspective, and it shows you the dot-com, the height of the dot-com. And we adjusted these numbers for inflation, and this was the amazing finding. We have now exceeded the year 2000 in terms of venture capital when you adjust it for inflation. So in other words, this number, 50 billion, is the most venture capital that Silicon Valley has ever generated in its history, even including the crazy dot-com period. That's amazing. I want you to know that that number is 79% of all the venture capital in California. It is now 45% of all the venture capital in the United States. These are stunning, remarkable figures. It's also interesting to note that the venture capital is going lots of interesting places, and that it is a diverse portfolio. We break this down for you carefully in the index. You can look at this, but you'll see that the venture capital is, for the most part, going to internet, software, those kinds of companies. That's one of the big shares. But then, after that, it's going into mobile communications and telecommunications. It's going into healthcare, and healthcare is a large sector that's newly emerging as one that shows great strength for our area. It's also going into things like autonomous vehicles, automotive, transportation, electric vehicle, infrastructure, electronics, industrial materials. It's interesting to see that the venture capitalists really are diversifying their portfolio. Now, what goes right along with this is the amount of invention that this venture capital fuels, and we try to measure that through patents. And here again, last year, we recorded the highest number of patents in Silicon Valley's history. If you want to know the raw number, it was 19,539 patents. That's how many patents came out of our region. And the patents are also spread across many of those same areas where you saw the venture capitalists investing. Computers, data processing, software, electricity, heating, cooling, electric vehicle infrastructure. Those kinds of things is what's fueling the patents. We now command 53% of California's patents. We command 12% of the nation's patents. That's with only 1% of the nation's population. Remarkable. We tried to figure out what the patents were per capita, and we figured out that in a room full of 1,000 people like this, there's at least 6, 8, or 10 people that hold a patent. That's probably the case here today. So in other words, as you look at 1,000 people in Silicon Valley, you know that at least 10 of them are holding patents. That's the kind of place that we are. I want to talk about the unicorns. The unicorn, as you know, is this mythical creature that is said to be out there in nature, but highly unusual, highly irregular. This has always been our understanding of unicorns. It's a term that has been applied to Silicon Valley's startup companies and newly established enterprises when they achieve a valuation of $1 billion. And when people thought about that, they thought, wow, $1 billion, that's unicorn-like. That had been our understanding of the unicorn phenomenon. Well, in Silicon Valley, it turns out unicorns aren't rare and unusual anymore. We're talking about herds of unicorns. That's what's happening now. We're no longer even talking about unicorns. We're talking about decacorns and hectacorns. A decacorn is a company valued at $10 billion. And a hectacorn would be a company still private. These are private companies. A hectacorn would be a company valued at $100 billion. And believe it or not, we have those in Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, we generated 12 new unicorn companies. These are new ones, right? Just in the past calendar year, 12 new unicorn companies. In San Francisco, we generated 17 new unicorns. That's a total of 29 in Silicon Valley. And in the United States as a whole, there were 53 new unicorns. So there we are, commanding about 2/3 of the unicorns in the entire country. Silicon Valley also has decacorns. You know what they are. They're Uber, they're Airbnb, they're Lyft, and Pinterest is a decacorn. We almost have a hectacorn. Uber is at $80 billion valuation as of today. We just checked. It's headed to become a hectacorn. Unless, of course, it goes public, and we're going to talk about that, because the initial public offering is also telling us an interesting story about Silicon Valley. Last year, 20 IPOs came out of our region. There are many who had been very concerned about this trend because we weren't seeing the IPO activity for a string of years there. Well, it seems to be back, fully back, happening. 20 from Silicon Valley, 8 from San Francisco, and that's a total of 28. That's a really robust number. It, again, is the lion's share of all of the IPOs that were happening in the country as a whole. You might be interested to know where the IPOs are concentrated. The figure on the left, pie chart on the left, is the nation's IPOs and how they break down by industry. And you'll see that they're spread across all kinds of different industries, including utilities, financials, industrials, and energy and real estate and things like that. Well, as you look at the pie chart on the right, that shows you how Silicon Valley's IPOs break down. And this was surprising to us. Healthcare companies. And we're including their life sciences. 65% of our IPOs are in that area, life sciences. These are companies that are dispensing medicine at the molecular scale, embedding it in your bloodstream, fighting cancer at the cell level in a way that's encoded to your DNA, detecting cancer in its very earliest stages. Those kinds of companies. And so they're going public at a rapid rate in Silicon Valley. Then we're also seeing another huge share in the category that we call industrials. This is materials science, new coatings, new materials that we're using in manufacturing processes. So that's your IPO picture. It's pretty stunning. But what's even more interesting is that in 2019, this year, the current calendar year, already with only a month gone by, we've seen 7 IPOs. 7 IPOs. And this, I want to say, despite a government shutdown, despite tremendous market volatility, and despite trade wars that are out there. So there's 7 total that we already saw. And then, as we look at the pipeline, we see that there are at least 6 more to come imminently. And this we know because they've hired bankers and they have filed with the SEC. And what's fascinating to me about these imminent IPOs is that they look to be generating valuations that will exceed previous record-setting valuations. Facebook set the record. It was a $104 billion valuation when they went public. But Uber, it's looking to be a $120 billion valuation. So again, this is pretty extraordinary. And then across the board, you can see these others that are threatening to go. Airbnb looks like that'll happen. Lyft, Pinterest, Slack will be coming on board at about $10 billion. So this is, I'm trying to paint a happy picture. Are you starting to get the vibe here? It's a pretty prodigious region when you look at these kinds of indicators. Let's talk about commercial development, just briefly. Commercial development is happening at a pace that we have not seen in Silicon Valley's history. Right now, there's 10 million square feet that were completed or in progress over the past calendar year. And again, we have to put that in perspective. If you add up all of the development over the last 3 years, it is greater than the previous 13 years combined. That's the kind of building boom that's going on in Silicon Valley right now, and you see it. You see the construction sites, you see the cranes going up into the sky. You certainly see it in San Jose, but you're seeing it in Mountain View, Fremont. You're seeing it Santa Clara, throughout the region. There's a boom in commercial construction. This was fascinating to us. Hotels have taken off. This is a new development. There are 56 hotels that have been planned for this coming year and the year beyond. 56 new hotels in Silicon Valley, and even more when you add in San Mateo County and San Francisco. We had not seen hotel development like that. In fact, what you see is from 2009 to 2013, no hotels were built, none. And now suddenly we're building hotels all over the place. Well, as we talk about all these cheerful, happy indicators, one important question is whether it translates into a sense of well-being for all of us who are living here. And well-being is something that you would measure many different ways. I don't want to suggest that this is the only indicator, but one indicator would, of course, be compensation and how people are faring in terms of their earnings. So this is another eye-popping chart that leaps off of the pages of the index. The average annual earnings for people living in Silicon Valley is approximately $140,000 per year. That's the average. Remember, you take all of the salaries, all of the options, bonuses, everything that's counted as an increase. That's what we're calling annual earnings. You take all of the people that are working in Silicon Valley's 3 million plus workforce, 1.5 million plus workforce, and you take the earnings and divide it by that number, and that's what you get. That's the average annual earnings, $140,000. The United States average, as you can see, $68,000. So Silicon Valley is double the national average. This is just stark, raving, amazing. That really tells you a lot about our region. However, there's problems with averages. We know this because averages are skewed towards the high earners, and we have many, many high earners in Silicon Valley. I've got a chart on that. So we also like to look at median household income. That's helpful. And so here's the nation. The median household income is $60,000 for the nation. Remember, median is where half or more than that, half or less than that. So the nation is 60,000, and then it turns out that in Silicon Valley, we are at 118,000. So almost, again, double in terms of national median income. So our households are faring rather well. unless you want to get into the details, and that's to come. Take a look at the growth of our high-income households. This is a chart that's telling you the share of our households that are commanding $200,000 or more in their salary as a household. That share has been climbing for 5 years in a row, to the point where today it is 26%. 26% of our households out there are making more than $200,000 on an annual basis. Here's a chart that tells you something about wealth in Silicon Valley. We took a look at of all the households out there. We wanted to know how many households have $1 million in disposable income. Now, we're not talking about the value of their house. We're talking about their assets that are in a bank or some other instrument. And of Silicon Valley, all of Silicon Valley's households, 87,000 of them are millionaire households. We have 87,000 millionaire households. In Silicon Valley, we also have 50 billion, we have 50 billionaires. That's the figure. 50 billionaires, 87,000 millionaire households. So that's giving you a sense of the wealth, the prosperity, the affluence that is being generated in Silicon Valley, that is continuing to be generated in Silicon Valley. Well, we have to talk about housing. Now, every year we always say, yes, Silicon Valley is a prosperous region, but our housing is through the roof, and this is our Achilles heel. It's killing us, and that's a true statement. However, I just want to say that in the past calendar year, I think some very significant things have happened to address the housing crisis. The first thing that's happened is that people are calling it a crisis now. That term has crept into the parlance, the general parlance. People don't talk about it as the housing issue anymore. They talk about it as the housing crisis. And it's perfectly clear now that our region is mobilizing in ways that it never has before. For example, we passed statewide Props 1 and 2. We have new legislation now coming at a rapid pace. Governor Brown signed 17 bills last year alone. There's more coming that does fast tracking. Santa Clara County, this county where we stand, generated Measure B, and that's putting together $1 billion for housing. Many of our cities have done aggressive changes to their zoning rules. Our big city mayors went out and made a pitch, a very public and aggressive pitch for state surplus funds to be put against homelessness in their regions. Just a couple of random examples. Mountain View approved 10,000 new units in the North Bay Shore, there where Google is building its fabulous headquarters. San Jose has committed to building 25,000. That's the goal that they stated for their city. In other words, people are getting serious. The governor, in his State of the State address, made it very clear that this is a high priority for him. I think maybe most significant of all is that the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association Bay Area Governments have combined in a historic merger of their two staffs and have combined substantively to work together on the twin problems of land use and transportation. They are linked as never before. And they've created this, CASA, it's the Committee to House the Bay Area. And this is a blue ribbon panel that's composed of CEOs and elected officials and the labor community and housing advocates and environmentalists, a broadly based coalition that enacted provisions that were signed by the boards of both organizations to tackle this housing problem, but to do it in ways that really are path-breaking. We're talking about attacking the sacred cows, addressing local control, generating new tax revenues and bonding revenues, taking public parcels that are unused or underdeveloped and putting those over to housing developments. So here are people at the final vote taken by the boards of those two organizations, and it just gives you a sense of the way the tide has shifted. So I even think, despite the prices, that there's good news on the housing front. Transportation is our other Achilles heel. We have twin Achilles heels. And of course, we all know this. We're straining our infrastructure with all of this growth. Nevertheless, things are happening. The voters last year passed Regional Measure 3. That's significant. Santa Clara, this county, passed Measure B, and it was upheld by the courts just as of 2 weeks ago. So that all of that money that was in an escrow account is now being placed against transportation projects. That is worthy of applause. And I want to recognize the business community in particular, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group that came to the fore and led that campaign. And we would be nowhere without the leadership of the business community and others. The BART is actually coming, believe it or not. It's coming to San Jose. That will happen. Caltrain is electrifying. In other words, there are things happening. I tend to think that there are also technology fixes that might just finally put us out of our misery. And here I'm talking about drones and flying automobiles, but also autonomous vehicles and all of the rest, which suddenly don't seem to be that far off. So there's things happening on the transportation front that can make us feel cheerful. You might be interested to know that we're bicycling more, and we're building more infrastructure for it. Bicycle collisions, not surprisingly, are going down because we're setting aside dedicated infrastructure. We're happy about that. Our region is adopting electric vehicles. We are becoming far more renewable, far more sustainable with our use of solar power. This was also very cheery to me. We continue to become a more diverse region. We are, in fact, the world's most diversified population. And in the last calendar year, we are no longer a majority white population. Actually, Asians are now the highest slice of our pie. Our Asian population is now 34%. Our white population is 33%, and then that's followed by our Hispanic population and all of the rest. So a very diversified region. This is also interesting. We're voting like we never have before. The midterm election was the highest turnout in Silicon Valley since the 1960s, since people were voting for John Kennedy. That was amazing. And also, our young people voted at record levels. They've never turned out in the same way that they did for the 2018 midterm election. And this was so wonderful. Yes, I think so. So let's drill down. Today, as of today, we have all of these seats that are elected for our public sector organizations. So of all of the public offices, 55% of those are held by men, 45% are held by women. But look at the trend. It used to be 64% held by men only 10 years ago. So that's remarkable progress. But it's even better than that, because in the last election, I can't remember how many seats were up for grabs, but 65% of those seats, new seats, were claimed by women. So we're electing women and putting them in high office. I think you should applaud. I think it's wonderful. We have long lamented that women are not as well represented in the workforce and that there are gaps and disparities there. This continues to be an ongoing problem for our region, or an ongoing opportunity for our region. But even here, there's progress to be reporting. For example, the share of early stage deals that are going to women founders has doubled. And the share of science and engineering degrees that is being granted to women is also rising precipitously. And then it's interesting, when you look at the workforce and you break it down, when you look at our tech jobs, you look at the percentage of people who are filling those tech jobs that are foreign-born. Then, of that segment, the foreign-born segment, it turns out huge majorities, 70%, are women. Actually, women in those roles. And so that tells us something interesting about our region. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to be happy, I think there's plenty here to be happy about. That's a pretty good story about Silicon Valley. But here's the thing. I can also talk out of the other side of my mouth. And I can tell you a very sad story about Silicon Valley, and I actually believe it. Both stories are true. So let's go back to our Rorschach test, and now let's talk about the sad things. The things that are troubling about our region, that continue to trouble us. Well, one for sure is what we're referring to as income disparity. So here's the same chart. This is the same chart that I showed you, but now we're just going to look at the glass being half empty, right? Which is to say that, okay, so our population is growing, and the segment of our population that is making $200,000 or more in their household is also growing, but that also means, correspondingly, that the wages are staying stagnant in the lower quartiles of our population and of our workforce. And this shows you that pretty dramatically. So here we are. we're adding these high-income households. They grew precipitously, but we're losing our mid-range households. This is showing the percent change in the number of households by income range over a 4-year period. And look at that, the middle range, just losing them altogether, right? That's happening, and then we're also losing that low range. And then here's that chart I showed you earlier, and it speaks to the affluence and the prosperity that is happening. But one question that we have to ask, by the same token, is whether that prosperity is widely shared. And we were astonished to learn that the top 2% of households in Silicon Valley command 27% of the wealth. That's the kind of income inequality that we're dealing with on a daily basis in Silicon Valley. So the other part of our story, and this is a very real part of our story, is that we have poor living among us. And we're living side by side, and there's a sense that we really are two valleys. The well-off and the people that really are not well-off. In fact, it's worse than that. They are desperately struggling to make a living, to make ends meet. These are the poverty rates as defined by the federal government. Now, this poverty rate shows us at 7.1%. That's less than the national average, so we can be cheerful about that. Less poverty in Silicon Valley. However, this is the national government standard, the federal standard, which we think is out of touch with reality. We think you have to adjust it for our high housing costs. And so what we like to use instead is the self-sufficiency standards, which were established by a team of academics. And according to the self-sufficiency standards, fully 35% of our population not self-sufficient. In order to live, in order to function, they require assistance from a church, a neighbor, a friend, a family. This is also our reality. And there's disparities by race, and that's troubling. It's also startling to learn that about 10% of our population is what we call food insecure. That means that they will live from day to day not knowing necessarily where their next meal is going to come from, 10% of our population. We talk about self-sufficiency. This is a chart that just shows you what minimum wage would do for you. I won't belabor it. We could talk about this at length, but minimum wage is not sufficient to survive in Silicon Valley, let alone thrive. It's not sufficient. By our calculations, you would have to be making, if you are a household that has one adult, one preschooler, and one infant, you somehow need to be making $65 an hour. And remember, the minimum wage is $12. Many Silicon Valley cities have raised it to $15, but it's not sufficient. We do have the nation's highest housing costs. I can rip through all kinds of charts. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe it's just obvious. We all know this. There used to be an asterisk attached to this chart. We used to say, well, there is a hamlet in Connecticut that's a little more expensive than we are, and you know, a couple of exceptions. No more asterisks. Period. Any way you measure it, monthly, square footage, mortgages, rents, we have the nation's highest housing costs. And that chart was showing you all kinds of mortgage, rent, and it's calculated on a square footage basis. This is our home sale prices. The median price of homes that are selling in San Mateo County is $1.3 million. That's just the median. In Santa Clara County, it's a little less, $1.2 million. Oh, here's your median sale prices. Our median home value estimates. I just want to dramatize this a little bit. So in San Mateo County, let's say, the median home sale price is $1.3 million. Well, if you were to make the down payment on a $1.3 million home, that would be about $272,000. Now, we have median income figures, and the median household income in that county is $116,000. In other words, you could save your entire salary for a whole year, and you still don't have enough for the down payment. We calculate that if you save 10% of your salary for 10 years, then you would have enough for a down payment. Those are our housing realities. By the way, that down payment, $272,000, would buy the median price home in any other state, right? All 49 states, you can go pay cash for any house at the median with the cost of a down payment in Silicon Valley. The inventory is not out there, and that's interesting. It picked up in the past calendar year, and of course, we're cheered about that, but the inventory used to be here. Now the inventory of houses for sale is much lower. It's because people are holding on to their houses for longer, and our tax laws have something to do with that, Prop 13 and others, and so this continues to be a very difficult thing. Rental rates are actually holding. And that's an interesting finding in the index. They did not increase over this past year or the year prior. And so it suggests to us that landlords have finally realized that that's about it. That's about what they can do. And beyond that, it's no longer connected to reality. And so then we have to talk about whether we're permitting enough houses. I won't belabor this either, but last year we had a downtick. So this is showing you all of the units that were permitted, multifamily, single family, and the number was less than 9,000 units. In Silicon Valley, we permitted less than 9,000 new units. Remember, I told you 35,000 new jobs, 9,000 new units. That's the disparity. And of course, we've been building a deficit over a long period of years. The deficit is staggering. So this is something that we have to think about. Then you can look at the housing that we are building, so all the housing that's out there, and you can ask, is it affordable? And affordable is a technical term. It means it means that people making the median income can qualify for that kind of housing. And 8% of our new housing was affordable. That's it, 8%. In other words, we're building luxury housing, and this shows you that. We're adding all kinds of housing that is affordable to people that are making above moderate income, but we're building only small segments of housing that is actually affordable. And as a result, no surprise, we're seeing a rise in multi-generational households throughout Silicon Valley, and this means not 2, but 3 generations living in one household together. Some of that's cultural and wonderful, and we celebrate it. Some of it is by necessity and not necessarily by choice. It's also interesting that the number of young adults that are still living with a parent. So these are people between 18 and 34. That percentage has risen. 30, close to 40% of young adults are living at home with their parents, and that's a number that's grown steadily over the past 7 years. We have rising costs, and this is also something that we have to grapple with in our region. They seem to be rising very rapidly, faster than inflation, I would say. This is, for example, childcare costs, and this shows you that it's now about $20,000 per year to have childcare for an infant, less than that for preschoolers, and those numbers are rising steeply with each passing year. Oh, I got a kick out of this. This is just Peggy Sue's outside our office. And so you go into Peggy Sue's and look at this. They've decided to abandon the sign, forget the sign. They just took out red duct tape and they covered up all the prices, and they just keep penciling them over because every day they raise the prices. And then the funniest thing to me was the kids' meal. Here they're saying for the kids' meal, they finally said you have to be 12 and under to have the kids' meal because all these people are trying to buy the kids' meal at those prices. So that tells you something about what's going on with Silicon Valley. Now, our transportation woes. I think I'm going to just gloss right over this because we all get it, right? We're stuck in traffic. We're choking on our traffic. I'll just make some big headlines, and then you can delve into these indicators in the booklet in front of you. Still, to this day, about 3/4 of us are driving alone to work. Nothing has budged that number. It's just not budging. We continue to prefer to drive alone, even though it means we're choking in exhaust. So that means the hours that we're losing to congestion delays are growing year by year by year. That's happening. You've seen that. You've experienced that. We measured the mean travel time to work and how that changes from time to time. So in 2007, it took about 24 minutes on average for people to get to work. In last year, it took about 30 minutes for people to get to work. So that's an increment of 6 minutes. It's taking you 6 minutes longer to get to work. Well, we did the arithmetic. That means that over the course of a year, you're losing 53 hours. Or in other words, you've spent more than an entire work week just sitting in your car that week as a result of that increment, just that extra increment. So those are the things that are happening. Mega commuters continue to astound us. Mega commuters are people that drive more than 3 hours. And I mean 3 hours round trip. That means they're driving 90 minutes to get here, 90 minutes to go home. And that's 6.5% of our workforce are doing that. 95,000 people this year are driving from across the Altamont or from Los Banos or something like that, and they're flooding into our region. Transit ridership, meanwhile, goes down. Despite all of the fabulous work that our agencies are doing, we're not buying it. We're not hopping on a transit. Last year, 3.5% decline in those figures. Caltrain, meanwhile, is going counter to the trends. People love Caltrain. I call it our little choo-choo train that goes up the peninsula, and it's at capacity, and that's why you only see this tiny incremental growth. It picked up 500 new riders daily riders over the last calendar year, but that's because they're packed. And if you ride Caltrain, you've seen it. It's standing room only, and there's nothing they can do about that until they can electrify and increase those frequencies. So that's the story. If you want to talk about Silicon Valley as a sad place, real issues that we have to grapple with, and that, of course, is our purpose today, is to think about this and to think about the big picture and how we address these kinds of challenges. Now, I want to talk to you about another way of looking at all of this in the very few minutes that I have remaining. So, you could say that we just took a very straightforward or even superficial approach to Silicon Valley in the minutes that just went by. Happy place, sad place. I'd like to say that maybe there's another way to think about it, and that is just to get some distance and to look at it in a way that's a little more clinical, or what I want to call contemplative. So this is the contemplative or thoughtful way of thinking about Silicon Valley, and that's just to ask if, besides these blaring indicators that leap out at us, are there underlying things that we should also be aware of? In the way that, you know the story about the frog that was put in the pot and it was gradually brought to boil, but the frog didn't notice, right, until it was too late. We're interested to see if we can uncover some of those things as well. And so what I want to signal for us, for our contemplation, is the phenomenon of bigness, of scale, of size, of concentration, and what that might mean for our valley. For example, we were talking about the amazing venture capital figures. I can't remember if I pointed this out, but of all of those amazing venture capital mega deals, unicorns, and all of the rest happening, you should know that most of that money is going into mega deals. A mega deal is 100 million or more. 100 million or more. So in Silicon Valley, 44 of the deals were mega deals, right? 100 million or more, and 37 in San Francisco. So 81, in other words, more than 60% of the venture capital was in these enormous, huge mega deals going into really large, you could call them well-established companies, not the struggling startups. So that's significant. Here's another very interesting finding. We hadn't seen this one coming. When you look at the job growth in the tech sector, we discovered that more than half of it was accounted for by two companies, Google and Facebook. That's it. And then if you added Apple into the picture, it was even more than that. It was difficult to get the numbers on Apple because they report differently, and I don't need to go into the details, but if you add Apple to this picture, the point obtains, which is most of our job growth in the tech sector is accounted for by a handful of companies, and people refer to them as FANG: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. That's where your tech growth is coming from. That's a new story for our region. Our old story used to be that the growth was happening across a wide panoply of companies of all different sizes, small, medium enterprises, and the big behemoths. Now we've turned into a valley that really is coming to be dominated on the job front and others by these large, well-established technology companies. Meanwhile, we have other companies that are downsizing, and here's a list of some of them. These actually reduced their workforce through layoffs and other means over the past calendar year. So that's interesting. When we look at commercial space, we see that also that's being dominated by FANG, by the big tech players, big tech. And it turns out that of all of that 10 million square feet that I was telling you about, fully 20% of it is those 5 companies. And you see it, they're starting to have this enormous footprint on the landscape. And then it was interesting to discover that of all of the acquisitions that are happening out there, tons of acquisitions, most of them are happening by these big companies. What we've discovered is that a prevalent path to exit is being acquired. And they're being acquired by, again, these same companies, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook. And so this lays it out for you how many of those acquisitions were happening. Well, that's interesting. Some people are looking at this and they're wondering if that is a sign of significant or fundamental change. Why would we say that? Well, think about it. Innovation used to be characterized as a thing that would happen across the whole face of the valley. You could refer to it as 1,000 flowers blooming out there. And, most startups would fail, but it was these scrappy entrepreneurial startups, guys sleeping on couches and eating pizza for years on end, and, funding it with their credit cards and maybe an uncle and something like that. And some of them made it, and then they would pursue this path to market presence and maybe ultimately to an IPO. So that was the old story. Now, what people are saying is that we've entered a new environment, a new world in which if you are doing anything significant, promising, or has the potential to be disruptive, well, you'll just get bought. They'll just grab you right there. And then at that point, the innovation now goes behind closed doors. It's no longer a thing that is taking place out under the light of day, and it's taking place in a very different kind of dynamic. So that's something we have to think about. And sure enough, we're now reporting for 3 years in a row there are less startup companies that are actually qualifying for seed funding. So that's an interesting trend that we should be thinking about. So some people are wondering if there's a big tech effect and if we have to be thoughtful about what that might mean long term for the character of innovation in our valley. Some people are concerned. They believe it stifles innovation and that it has these externalities, so to speak. It has some downsides that we actually need to consider. I'm going to blow through this because I'm out of time and I want to keep us on schedule. But some people are arguing that as a result of our high prices, as a result of this volatile and hostile environment for the entrepreneur, that we're now ripe for poaching. And sure enough, we took this picture just outside here, and these are people advertising. This is Melbourne, Australia, saying, come to Australia, we'll take care of you. We have better deals, we have better prices. And sure enough, it's true. This is real estate prices, commercial rental rates across the nation, and ours are the highest, with one exception, and that would be New York. And we also have charts in the index showing you that we are losing people. Tech talent is starting to go elsewhere, and we document that. It's going to Austin, it's going to Seattle. That's starting to make sense. And so there are other places. It's no longer the case that Silicon Valley is the only place that you can be innovative. And so the character of this place might be changing. It might be changing in subtle, imperceptible ways that you only notice over a 5-year period or a 10-year period, but it might be happening. And sure enough, in the index, we're reporting that last year we lost people. This was the first year in many where there were more people leaving Silicon Valley than were coming into it. And there were polls showing that 40% of respondents say that they're planning to leave our region because it's too crazy, it's too expensive, and all the rest. So this, by the way, I just want to point out, is happening against a backdrop of some really bad press. These are reputable publications that are saying that Silicon Valley's best days might be behind it because all of these structural factors are starting to overwhelm the innovation effect. And so when we talk about the Rorschach test, one possible response is just massive confusion or anxiety or concern about what's happening because you have all of these things that people are identifying. Some of these are cultural and other effects, but nevertheless, these things happening, and it makes you wonder about the long-term viability of our region. Well, that's the Silicon Valley Index. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll let you decide if you feel happy, if you feel sad, if you feel confused, anxious, or if we're just going to spend the rest of our day being thoughtful, rational, and contemplative. But that's the purpose of the index in this exercise. Thank you for joining us in that spirit.